Cool. Yeah, sorry about that. Was just playing a game here. I still have the original classic Game Boy, the gray edition, and this is a replica. It actually uses an FPGA chip that emulates how a Game Boy is supposed to work. So it's brand new technology, but still playing games from 1989, which is awesome that you can still do that. Welcome here. This is going to be an hour of, I hope, entertainment for you all. First of all, I am not an historian. I'm just a dude that plays video games a lot. So I thought, why not make a session that goes through the very beginnings of video games and then all the way up to now where we are with the ray tracing and everything that's going on. The reason why I do this also is because I got inspired a few years ago to make an emulator of the Game Boy because of David. And I also ported the Doom source code to C# just because I had way too much time on my hands. So if you're interested, you can find me afterwards and then find the source code online. And also Nico is here. He's a former colleague of mine. He's doing a talk on Maui. So he took my stuff from Doom and then went to Maui with it. Now, when I ask you the question, what is the very first video game? What do you think it is? Nothing, apparently. Well, most people think it's Pong, because Pong is a very old video game. It's from November 29, 1972. But it's not the first one. The reason that most people think it is because it's the one that's most present in culture. And also because it was one of the very first arcade games that was really, really popular in the time. And if you happen to have one of these cabinets and open it up, it had a very large logic board inside with all the transistors and the diodes and everything. This is not that original board. This is already a shrunken down version of it, like many years later already. And the thing is, Pong did not use a CPU. It did not run code. All the game logic was made up by flip-flops and latches and transistors and logic gates, that's all. That's what the first video games were like. Of course, a few years later, they managed to shrink down the game even more into a single chip so that you can play Pong in your house on your own set. This picture is taken from the Computerspiele Museum in Berlin, so you can still play that Pong there if you want to. But if Pong was not the first video game, which one was? In 1947, Thomas Goldsmith Jr. and Ethel Ray Mann created a game using only analog circuitry, and they patented that idea. And this game was a simulation of World War II, basically. Shooting missiles towards a target, and then destroying whatever target was there, and then so on and so on. And it only used a cathode ray tube, CRT screen, an oscilloscope to generate the pictures, and then had analog controls like a dial. We had a potentiometer that changed the circuit or the voltage to change where you're going to aim your missile at. And then using an overlay of graphics, you knew where the targets were supposed to be. Now, this device was never manufactured nor marketed to the public. It was only the idea and perhaps a prototype, but not actually a game that you could go out and play. Also, the image here is just AI generated because there is no image of this game. This was just the very first idea of a game using electronics. 3 years later, we get the first real video game. This one used actual digital electronic circuits for game logic and had inputs that you can press, and then your move, when you played your move, would light up on the big screen, and then the computer made their move. And this game was tic-tac-toe. In this case, it was called Bertie the Brain. And it was created for the Canadian National Exhibition in 1950. But again, this was not made for your entertainment. Well, it was during the exhibition for your entertainment, but this was not something you could just buy and play, because as you can see, it's a huge machine. This was just built to showcase a new technological device called the Aditron tube. You had vacuum tubes that were the transistors of the time, and this was a smaller version of that vacuum tube. And the person who invented this, which was, I have to read this because I don't remember names, I'm not a historian, Dr. Joseph Cates, he built this device to showcase what you could do with the Aditron. After the exhibition was over in Canada, this device was just being dismantled because he had no interest in building this as a game that people could play, unfortunately. A year later, we get another first game, the Nimrod. And this was built by Ferranti in the UK for the Festival of Britain in 1951. It too was a huge device. It measured almost 4 meters by 3 by 1.5. And it was designed to play the game Nim. When I looked this up, I didn't know what Nim was, but the idea is it's a mathematical puzzle where you have like stacks of matches, typically, 1 match, 2 matches, 3 matches, 4, and 5. And then every time you make a move, you can take away as many items you want from one of the piles. So either the first match, 1 or 2 from the second row, 1, 2, or 3 from the third row, and so on. And the person who takes the last matches away wins. Or you can play it in reverse mode. If you force the last player to take the last match, you win as well. And this computer was built to play both of those versions and used, again, simple lights to indicate the piles, and then had an input desk panel where you could play your move. And again, if you want, you can head over to Berlin. They have a replica there that you can play as well. Both this computer and Bertie the Brain were considered to be the actual very first video games, although they both like a display that can visualize real-time graphics. They just use simple light bulbs. The actual first game with real-time graphics was Spacewar on the PDP-1 computer. If you don't know the PDP-1, it's a machine that used these very long cards with holes in it. You had to feed into the machine, and that was your programming. And then it started running your program. So you had to prepare those cards very meticulously, because one error meant your code had a bug, and then see the result on, in this case, an oscilloscope-like device. This game had a star in the center where you fly around with 2 warships in a dogfight, and then it used the star to simulate gravity. So if you came close to the star, you would go near it and then bend off. And the trailing that you see on the screen as well is just because it's a phosphorus screen, so you see the trail where you were from the spaceship. It also had different levels of difficulty, and this was also one of the first open source software, because the person who wrote this game, Steve Russell, well, there was no GitHub back then, of course, but they published this and said, if you want the code, give us a call, we'll mail it to you, no worries, you get it. Which inspired the first arcade machine. So someone built Spacewar, added a little bit of extra features, and made it into the first coin-operated arcade machine that you can play. And this game inspired many other games like Asteroids further on. Now, back in those days, a lot of magazines started coming with, like this one, Byte magazine, who had nothing than, of course, advertisements. Buy your own computer. This is our next machine with a floppy disk. Wow. And it also contained a lot of code. And then you could take that code, type it in, and then run it on your own machine. And the code, well, it's not really readable, of course. But this listing is one of many listings in assembly that allowed you to play Spacewar on your Intel 8080 machine. The first really commercially produced video game console was the Magnavox Odyssey, already released in 1972, which is 10 years before I was born. This device had a simple controller attached to it with a cable and a few knobs it could turn. And it didn't really contain any computer logic. It just had, again, logic chips and gates working together to produce a game output, to react to your input. But it did have 28 different games. You could put in a game card, which kind of looks like a cartridge, but it was not a cartridge. It did not contain any code. It was simply bridging some connections that altered the logic of the machine. And that's how they had different games. And it included, of course, a version of Pong. They called it table tennis because of reasons. But this was included in the game box. And a lot of the games that you could play of those 28 were different copies of each other. But then they said, if you want to play game number 10, use cartridge number 1 and put this on your TV monitor. And then that changes the game, because it was a different layover. Meanwhile, due to the success that the arcade version of Pong, Atari was working on their first video console as well. They started working on this in 1974, as I already said, by shrinking down that logic board that was Pong into a single chip. And they ended up with this device, the Telegames device. It was not branded Atari. It does say Atari on the power button. But they actually had to go to another company, Sears, to get enough money to start producing this, and they wanted to bring it under the Sears brand Telegames. So this is the very first Atari console, but not really from Atari. Now, this is all United States-based. There was also a company that used to create card games, and then more recently started to go into the tabletop world of games. And they noticed across the pond they're doing something there with TVs and consoles. We might need to do the same thing. So in 1974, Nintendo reached out to Magnavox and say, hey, we want to distribute that Odyssey thing here, and we also want to do our own stuff and then release your games on it if you'd like to. And they said, sure, we have nothing in Japan, so go ahead. And so in '75, Nintendo, together with Mitsubishi, because they did not have the knowledge yet, created their first console, the Color TV game. Again, very simple device, no controllers attached with a wire. You have to sit at the actual thing and then twist the knob, player 1, player 2, and then you could play games again like Pong or table tennis. Now, the biggest selling point of this device was the price. You could have your own color TV game for just 9,800 yen. If you don't know how much a yen is worth, that might say nothing to you. But if you wanted that Pong clone device, you had to shell out 19,000 yen, which is almost 10,000 yen more for just one game. This one had more games. And Atari also wanted their own Pong game there, because this was another Pong clone. And that one was, because of import cost, 24,800 yen. So this one really was the first best sold console in the world. Nintendo said, we're onto a winner here. So they started producing more versions of the same thing, one of which had a steering wheel, first console with a steering wheel, and you could play racing games. And they also had a block-only version that had different variations of the game Breakout, also by Atari. Now, up until now, all these consoles had the games inside. Apart from the Magnavox with the cartridges, they didn't have any logic that you could extend it to it. In '76, we got the first console that uses cartridges, which has a ROM chip with logic on it. Meet the Fairchild Channel F. Here is your first microprocessor-driven console with multiple cartridges in games. And this started the second generation of consoles. But nobody remembers this device, unfortunately, because this was a groundbreaking thing. Nobody remembers it because somehow Atari got wind of what they were doing and said, here is our Atari video computer system, better known as the Atari 2600, and also available as a Lego set, which I can recommend. Released in 1977, and this is the first console also that I know. You had different cartridges, you put it in, you turn it on, and you had one joystick and one button, and that was it. But boy, that was hooking me for a long time to the TV. And it had awesome low-resolution games like Kombat, where you drive a little tank, and you could shoot the other tank, and you had a score, and then you could win from the other person. But of course, these games are not going to hook your children if you have them. If they see these graphics, they're like, I'm not going to play that. In 1978, in Japan, a lot of this is coming from Japan, by the way, there was a new hit arcade game. Tomohiro Nishikado from Taito Games had been playing Breakout by Atari, also a great game. And this game actually had a backstory. The paddle was a spaceship, and you were shooting the blocks to, I don't know, defeat aliens somehow. And he was like, I can do better. I can make my own game. And you actually shoot aliens that move around in the screen, making it more difficult than instead of the blocks that were fixed on the screen. And you have a spaceship that you control, and you have obstacles in your way. And this game really was the biggest hit of all. It was also the first game that gave you lives. So whenever you died, if you were shot in your spaceship, then you lost a life. And then if you gained enough points, you gained a life. That was completely new, not seen before. Groundbreaking stuff. Atari said, we need a piece of that action. And they immediately decided to license this game for their Atari 2600, which gave their sales numbers a gigantic boost. And things really start going. This is the golden era of video games. So one game was released after another. We get Missile Command, which was another World War thing, where you, again, had incoming missiles, and then you had to use a trackball, also world first, to point where you want to shoot and then destroy as many missiles as you can in one shot. Arcades were ranking in money. They had so many quarters in the machines that they stopped working. And they didn't know why, because someone was playing the game after game after game, and all of a sudden the machine went down. And they said, what's going on? And they went to the machine, they opened the door, and it started flooding quarters. It couldn't accept any more quarters. They had to empty them every hour, because the games were so popular. Now, after a while, though, they started making less money. And the reason is very simple. People got good at the games. In the beginning, if you start a game like this, you played maybe for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then you had to put in another quarter because you were done, you lost. But as they went on, they could stand there all day with just one quarter. So a bunch of guys from MIT said, that's not a good thing. These people want to make more money. So they bought a Missile Command game. They opened it up, and looked how it worked, reverse engineered the chips that made the game run, and they made a ROM hack, the very first ROM hack. And they plugged in that board into the machine, called it Super Missile Attack, and they had a new game, and then they sold those kits to arcade halls. They could simply install them, and they had more money because the game was difficult again. Now, of course, Atari didn't like this, because someone was doing stuff with their game, and Atari wasn't making money on this. So they sued the company founded by these MIT guys, who actually, they dropped out of MIT. They said, we're making more money with this than we could ever do with our degree. And they got sued. So they settled with Atari, and they said, we're only going to do these kits before and get your approval first. But there was another great game in that time frame released called Pac-Man. And the idea of Pac-Man came again from Japan, Toru Iwatani, and it was going to the arcade halls in Japan and seeing what kind of games people were playing. So if you have 10 machines, are they all 10 occupied or only 5 really popular? But he also noticed, I'm only seeing men in the arcade halls. I want to see women playing games too. What kind of games would a woman like to play? Now, this is his opinion, not mine. But perhaps it's one that doesn't involve shooting aliens or people. And he went with his team to grab a pizza, and he was brainstorming ideas, and then they took a slice of the pizza, and then suddenly he was like, wait a minute. I think we found our guy. And that's how Pac-Man, the character, was born. And then they made a game that involved, well, still eating ghosts, but also eating cherries and fruit. Was happy eating ghosts. But that was immediately a hit in Japan in the arcade, attracting indeed both male and female players. They got all the players in the arcade now. It was also the first character that got a TV show. You could see Pac-Man on your television as a TV show, and merchandising and everything. And again, this game also came over to the States. People were playing, but people got good at the game, and it became boring and didn't pay a lot of money anymore. So those guys that now had a deal with Atari said, we can fix this game. But this was not owned by Atari, it was owned by Namco. So they actually went to Namco and said, we're going to improve your game. Namco said, no. We said, yes, because we have been sued by Atari and we won. Which was a bit of a lie, but Namco said, damn, sure, go ahead, do it. And that's how we got Miss Pac-Man. That was the ROM hack for Pac-Man. So again, we got many, many more games. Some were good, some were lesser good, but for the Atari home video console, everyone could make a cartridge. And everyone started making cartridges because everyone wanted a piece of the action. And the games became copies of each other because why not? Just use the same thing, change the colors, change the title, ta-da, new game. So we, as a consumer, we were like, that's rubbish. That's good. That's rubbish. And eventually it was like, oh, rubbish, rubbish, rubbish. Now, in June 1982, Steven Spielberg created E.T., a movie that I saw as a kid and I loved as a kid. And Atari said, we want to make a game for this movie. So they saw that movie as well when it was released, and then said to one of their developers, we have an idea. He said, okay, I'm listening. We want to make a game for that movie E.T. Okay? You've got 5 weeks to do this. You laugh, correctly so. Most of the games back then took about 5 or 6 months to complete. He only had 5 weeks. He said, yeah, all right, I'll do it. And then they said, great, you're on the first plane to Steven Spielberg, present your ideas to him tomorrow. And he's like, what? So they shipped him to Steven with his ideas. Steven said, can't you make it more like Space Invaders? And he was like, really, Space Invaders? Your movie's not about shooting aliens. We want to do something that more aligned with the movie. He said, oh, yeah, sure, you're right. So he flew back, and in some miraculous way managed to create E.T. the game in 5 weeks. And the reason he only got 5 weeks, by the way, is because they wanted the game to be in the stores by Christmas 1982. And they needed a lot of time for marketing, producing the cartridges, etc., which is also the mean. We all know that marketing is more important than developing a product. And again, E.T. the game, which looked like crap. And some parts were like stolen from the movie. I mean, E.T. had a certain amount of life. And as he moved around, he lost his life, his energy. And he regained energy by eating the candy like he ate candy in the movie. But here, he often fell into a pit, like Pitfall. But that was not part of the movie. So, needless to say, the critics were very hard on this game. And even though Steven Spielberg played this game and said, yeah, ship it, it was not a great success at all. And combined this with the release of many rubbish other copies of games led actually to the video game crash in 1983, where Atari even dumped a whole truckload of cartridges in a landfill and covered it with concrete. Not only E.T. copies, by the way, you also see Centipede in there, but the entire American video game market had enough. It was almost dead and buried. Now, in Japan, people were still playing games. They didn't have E.T., luckily for them. And Nintendo had just released their first cartridge-based console as well, the Famicom, or the Family Computer. And they reached out to their branch in America, Nintendo of America, and said, hey, we want you to bring this machine in America as well. And Nintendo of America said, nah, no way in hell are people going to buy that machine right now because it looks way too much like the other top-loading cartridge machines that we have in the market, and they're done. But what if we do something different? Because people have a VCR these days, so they can play cassettes and watch movies and record stuff from TV, and that's an entertainment system that's really booming right now. What if we change this top-loading thing, this Bordeaux white machine, into something that looks more like a VCR, like an entertainment system? And so the Nintendo Entertainment System was born in 1985. It took them a while to redesign the machine, but it's the same thing as a Famicom. It just looks like a VCR. And this became a huge hit, both in America and Europe and in the rest of the world. And what they also did at Nintendo, because Nintendo of America said to Japan, look, we have to do something about this wild growth of cartridges because whatever Atari is doing, it ain't working. And Nintendo of Japan said, what if we license the ability to create games for our platform? You have to buy a license, and we are going to judge your game before you get the right to make a cartridge. And they did that by including a special chip in the machine, and then you had the same chip on your cartridge, and you could only get those from Nintendo. And if you didn't have the chip, your game would not run. There are some people that found a way around it by overvolting your Nintendo system and just say, hey, if you start our game and it doesn't work, just start it again. It might eventually work. And this started the console wars between Nintendo and Sega. I had to do that voice from the commercials. Sega was another Japanese game company who originally created slot machines for casinos and boats. And they were like, we can do this shit as well. So we're going to create our own console system, the SG-1000. And they released it in Japan. Only in Japan, where the Famicom also was released. They released it on the same date as Nintendo did their console. And they got some traction, but not a lot, and they created new revisions of this console until they arrived at the Mark III, which they sold everywhere else as the Master System. And this had a Zilog Z80 CPU, which was way more easy to create games for, rather than the custom chip that Nintendo had. But alas, the Sega had a very small game library because Nintendo was very smart and said, we're going to go to the major publishers and then reel them in, and Sega only had like the leftover pickings. So they had a very, very small game library. But somehow, Sega was more popular in Europe, and Brazil, and South Korea, and Australia. I did not have a Nintendo Entertainment System in my home when I was a kid. I had a Sega Master System, and the Game Boy. But that's another story. And again, the game was on. Nintendo released some very notable games on their NES console, like Donkey Kong, the original one, arcade hit as well, Popeye, which was a very popular cartoon at the time, and they released a video game for it. Mario Brothers, they're also an arcade hit. The first tennis game, not Pong, actual tennis. Duck Hunt, where you had the dog that laughed at you if you missed every duck. And the zapper, not the first zapper, by the way, someone already did that, but you could shoot your television without breaking it, not unlike the Wii controllers that you throw at it, which worked by simply replacing the screen when you hit the trigger, and then only a white dot appeared where you could hit something, and if that laser, infrared, hit that white thing and bounced back, you actually had a point. And of course, Super Mario Brothers. Legend. Sega had their own hits, like Alex Kidd in Miracle World, which I played a lot because it was a game that was included in their redesign of the Master System, the Master System 2. The Ninja. If I see those graphics now, I'm like, oof. But I played that game. Space Harrier, which was a first Mode 7 game, if you will. Also a port from a successful Sega arcade game. Wonder Boy, which was also released on other platforms like the Commodore 64. Rocky, if they have Popeye, we have Rocky, goddammit. And Outrun. You probably know this game. I played this on a computer when I was 11 years old for the first time. And that was an amazing game. And games began to grow larger and larger, because in the beginning, they only had like small cartridges with very low amount of memory. But they started to become smarter and include chips that allowed them to switch banks on the cartridge. So they had cartridges with megabits of data, and the games became cleaner and nicer. Like Mega Man 2 on the Nintendo. But it also meant that games had so much content that it became difficult to complete them in one playthrough. And nothing can hurt a kid more than your parents saying, "It's time to shut down the console, dinner's ready." "But I'm already there, I just need to finish the last level. Shut it down now." And of course, you know what happened. If you didn't shut it down, they came in, bap, pressed the button, and then you could start over from the beginning again. And Mega Man solved this by having a password system. So whenever you defeated one of the end-level bosses, you got a code in the form of dots. And if you enter those dots again, the game said, that means you finished that guy, that guy, that guy, and you could go and go further where you left off. Now, of course, this only worked for a while, and this also worked because there's no real internet back then. There were bulletin boards, but I didn't use those. And games became even larger than this. Games started to have coins and hearts that you could gather, and weapons and different items. And if you had a password system for every little thing that changed, you would need like an entire book to keep those passwords. So Zelda had save games for the very first time. And it's really simple if you know how it works. They just included an additional chip on the cartridge, a RAM chip next to the program chip and the character chip in this case, and a battery that just provided a little bit of power to that RAM chip to say, here's your data and keep it. And it easily worked for up to 20 years, one battery and a cartridge. That also means that if you have a cartridge lying around these days, that the battery is probably corroded. If you want to restore these things, never, ever, ever put your soldering iron to a battery. They explode. Just use it on the contacts of the tabs instead, and do it very shortly. Don't ask me how I know. But you can restore them if you want to. Now, the consoles had many, many, many problems to solve. Developers back then really had to go all out to make these games work. For example, the Nintendo only had 2 kilobytes of work memory and 2 kilobytes of video memory. But if you look at the resolution, which is 256 by 240 pixels, and you say, okay, that means we have about 60,000 pixels. And every pixel, because of how the Nintendo works, you can put 4 pixels in 1 byte, which is an optimization. But you still needed for 15 kilobytes of memory to output one screen if you draw pixel by pixel. And you only have 2. So where are we going to get those additional 13 kilobytes from? And Nintendo solved this by saying, we're not going to draw pixels. We're going to pre-draw those pixels when you design the game and call them tiles. And then you can load up 2 tile sets and then just reference those tiles in your game, and then you only need 960 tiles for one screen, and 1 byte per tile, which is 960 bytes per screen. And you have memory to spare. You can put other stuff in that memory now. So you can easily swap out palettes and tiles and meanwhile have your screen. Or you can even have more screen data and then wrap your window around, which is what they actually did. And what if you want to have random number generators in your game? Maybe you want to calculate how much damage you're doing to an enemy or receiving from an enemy if you encounter someone. Or if you run around in an open world game, have random encounters. These games systems did not have a random number generator chip in them. That was not a thing. So if you played Final Fantasy, they simply solved this by having a fixed number table in ROM with random numbers. They probably rolled the dice and then had a random table, 256 entries. And then you would go, yeah, but if you start a game and you start playing at index 0, you're still playing the same game over and over and over again. Ah, said Squaresoft, but that's not how we do this. We start a counter that goes up from 0 whenever you power on the game, and when you press start, that's the number we're going to pick for our first index. And that's how Final Fantasy became a game that has a different experience, depending on when you press start. Which also means that speedrunners and tool-assisted runs with tasks wait for a certain amount of time to go by to have the easiest game that they can play when they play this game. Another trick you could do is use a pseudo-random number algorithm and then use whatever's left in the RAM chip of data, because this is electronics. It contains random data when it starts. And use that to initialize your pseudo-random number generator. It's very funny if you play those games on an emulator, because an emulator typically clears the RAM. And that also gives you the same game over and over. So some emulators fix this by putting random stuff in the RAM before starting a game. Now, we already now moved to the third generation. Well, we were in the third generation, sorry. So we're now in the fourth generation, the 16-bit era, with the turbo graphics, which I have never seen in my life, to be honest. But I saw the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom, and the Sega Mega Drive, or if you're from the United States, the Sega Genesis, because of copyright stuff. But these were not the only consoles out there. And again, TurboGrafx, I've never seen that one up close. I've seen this one, the Philips CDI, ready for your edutainment. It was built mostly for virtual museums and other stuff, but they also had some Disney games and even Nintendo games released on this. And it was quite good because it had video coming from that disc, compact disc, interlaced with code. So you could play a game and then have a video and then play the rest. There was another console, SNK's Neo Geo. This was actually an arcade cabinet with very large cartridges, and this one was a beast. It had not only a 16-bit CPU, just actually a 16-bit CPU with 32-bit registers, but also a 24-bit, I don't know how that works, GPU with a 24-bit address bus. And this one had way fancier titles than the others, which also meant it was pricey. And the home version came in at $650 US, whereas the Super Nintendo was priced at $200. So it didn't sell a lot of these. This was a luxury console. If you had this, you were fucking rich. I didn't have this, not at all. I played these games in the arcade. And again, TurboGrafx, Neo Geo CDI, they weren't that popular. Sega and Nintendo, that's where it's at. We have Super Mario World versus Sonic the Hedgehog, and they were competing on TV, mostly in the United States, against each other. Sega and Nintendo were battling on screen. And Nintendo released game after game, and at some point said, we have a machine which is good, but not good enough. And they already had in mind that they were going to release games with additional chips on them with extra processing power. And this one was by far the most popular game, known as Star Wing, where I live, and Star Fox in the States. And it included, you can see it on the left, the Mario Chip 1. We know it as a Super FX, which had a floating point CPU, and it was for calculating 3D vectors, and then you had a very first polygonal video game. And Sega said, whatever Nintendo does, we can do better. Bam! Virtual racing, baby, with our Sega virtual processor. And then someone said, this thing is costing us $100 per cartridge. We're not going to make other games like this. So this was the one and only answer to the Super FX chip, whereas Nintendo had quite a lot of games using the Super FX and Super FX2 chips. Instead, Sega was banking more on something else and said, we're going to build a CD drive for our Mega Drive and call it the Sega CD or Mega CD, wherever you live. And then they had refurbished that chunky console into a smaller version, and then it had a different kind of Sega CD that you could use. And then you had games on the CD with better audio and better loading times because they included another processor and an extra RAM on the Sega CD. But that's not all, said Sega. We're ready for the next future. Here is our 32-bit processor game console thing that you have to put on the other console because it doesn't work standalone. And don't get me wrong, powerful thing. Had 2 RISC 32-bit CPUs. But it was difficult to make games for, and developers said, no. They only had 40 game titles for this thing, most of which were parts of the original Sega Genesis games, which were just a little bit better than the older ones. So this one completely flopped. Oh yeah, and it's also very funny to see you could combine these things and have a monster of a console. You could actually also include, well, maybe not on this way. They also had like an adapter to play Sega Master System games for the Mega Drive. Super Nintendo also had something that you could play Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo, by the way. But this thing also required 3 separate power adapters to power everything. Now, the reason why Sega went for the Sega CD was because TurboGrafx also had a CD extension, and they also heard that Nintendo was talking to Sony for an add-on for their Super Nintendo. And at the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, in 1991, Sony had a very big presentation. They showed the PlayStation, Nintendo PlayStation. Nintendo and Sony were working together to build a console that could play SNES games and Super Disc. And Nintendo would create the games, and Sony would create the discs, and then together, boom, here's our new console. But Nintendo was thinking, these guys at Sony, they're pretty smart. And I'm thinking that Sony is going to create their own shit without us. So behind Sony's back, they talked to Philips, the people from the CDI, big company in the Netherlands, and they struck a deal with Philips instead. And the day after Sony announced their PlayStation console, this console, Nintendo had their own announcement saying, we're no longer working with Sony, we're working with Philips now. And Sony was like, and Nintendo thought that Sony would back down with their tail between their legs, but Sony said, nah, we're going to make a PlayStation, all right, but it's not going to play SNES games anymore. And so the PlayStation arrived. And the PlayStation 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, the ugly version. Now, I'm going to take a break from the console world, because I only have 10 minutes left as well. And I want to talk about Mortal Kombat. Of course, arcade hit game, released on almost every platform. And it wasn't the first fighting game, but it definitely made an impact, pun intended. You had, instead of cartoon graphics like Street Fighter 2 or a pixel version of something that did like against someone else or like Punch Out on the NES, you had actual digitized people. These were filmed and then put in the game. That's not all. When you hit someone, they actually bled. And if you won 2 rounds against them, you could kill them. So people were like, I mean, I was a 10-year-old. I was like, damn, that's a fun game. I love this game. My parents were like, are we sure we want to have this game played by our son? And my parents were not the only parents that thought this. So there was also nothing regulating this. These games arrived in stores, and other than the box art and the text you could read, there was nothing really that said, this game is perfectly suitable for your 10-year-old to have as a Christmas or a birthday present. So in America, there was a congressional hearing about this game and other games that came out by then. And they said, nah, we can't let this go on like this. We already have a rating system for movies. We're going to have the same rating system, the ESRB, for games right now. So That's why we now have no more nice things. Now we have to look at the game and say, oh, I'm sorry, son, this is not for you, this is for daddy. There's also a small video, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. Well, I can play a little bit. This is how they make
So all this
sound.
stuff sounds really small now. But when we take it into my office later and start messing with it, processing it, pitch shifting it, distorting it, like it's going to sound a lot different than this. It's going to be really cool.
Can I try one?
This is
Yeah,
how you
go
break
for
an
it.
arm. I'm not
You
kidding.
killed it, man. You want to move on to some different fruits and stuff?
And this is how it gets really gory. I'm not
That one
joking.
right there was good.
That's how they make the sound effects for Mortal Kombat. I love this. But now, if we skip now to the PC world, the first real computers that people start playing games on, one of them was the Apple II, where you could play games like Zork, the text adventure game, where you had someone describing what you could see, and then you say, I want to go east. Well, you see a forest which is dimly lit. I wouldn't go there. Okay, let's go north. Yeah, no, that's not an option either. Okay, south then. And then you could see, you can see a rope. Grab rope. And then you had a rope in your inventory. So a lot of games like this came out. And then we got the first real role-playing game, Akalabeth, the World of Doom. Very graphical, as you can see. Lovely game. Very inspiring, I guess, if you like fractals. Another machine was the Commodore 64, which I loved. I didn't own one, family did, but I was like, you can load and save stuff that you type in from a magazine on a cassette tape, and then go fast forward the cassette tape to the right marker. If you went too far, you had to go all the way to the end and then turn the cassette on. Really tedious, but you could go to the cassette marker and then say, load. And then the machine said, okay, press play on tape. And then your game started. Awesome. And games became better. On the PC, we got Ultima, the very first Ultima, with graphics, but no input. I mean, not as we now know it. You had to type what you wanted to do, just like with the text adventures, but you had real-time graphical feedback. And then there was someone, Jordan Mechner, who created this one. And this one was very nice. It wasn't his first game. His first game was Karateka, a karate game, with similar graphics, by the way. But this one was the first one where you had fluent motion on an Apple II system. And others, of course. But this was, back in those days, amazing. Now, I also have a video how it did this, explaining how it did this. Basically, rotoscoping, the same as Disney, how they created Bambi. They videotaped actual animals, and then they laid a paper on top and started tracing the paper, and then put it in the machine, and that's how he also did it. He videotaped his brother running, jumping, sliding, and then put that in the Apple II.
So
If you want to see the video, I can give the links afterwards, but in the interest of time, I have to talk about Wolfenstein 3D. 1992, id Software, bunch of people in one room creating the grandfather of the FPS genre. Of course, where there's a grandfather, there also must be a father. Doom in 1993. And this one, again, sparked some controversy because you're shooting demons, and apparently we shouldn't shoot demons, they have feelings. And this was a great game. It had a 3D engine, which means 3D environment with sprites that turn around, so it's 2.5D. But it was a great game, great engine. It also had network play. You could play against someone else over serial cable or IPX. And people still play this game today. And people still port this game today, like me. or others who run this on very small, tiny devices, a printer or something, everything. It's become the meme, can it run Doom? Not like can it run Crysis, but every device can run Doom these days. Westwood Studios created Dune 2, Battle for Arrakis. It was not the first real-time strategy game, but it sure inspired every other real-time strategy game with the menu and the fact that you could interact with your units on the ground with a mouse. This game laid the foundation for Command & Conquer, Warcraft Orcs vs. Humans. SimCity, a very difficult game. Complex city management, aliens destroying your city. But this game inspired, of course, many other SimCity games, but also Zoo Tycoon, Theme Park, The Sims, all because of this pixel game. Moving up a notch, Max Payne by Remedy Entertainment. We had seen videos like The Matrix with the bullet time move where Neo goes like, I'm not going to do it because I'm going to lie here on the floor, but this game had bullet time for the very first time, and we loved it. I mean, I loved it in any way. Also, very great game, film noir style, comic book, good story. And then, of course, when Blizzard was still creating good games, we had World of Warcraft. They took their Warcraft 2 and 3, which had amazing lore, and created a very influential, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which still played today and then rebooted and rebooted again, but sure. It wasn't the first, though. The first multi-user dungeon game was Mud Multi-User Dungeon, which you could play against each other over SSH. In 1978. And Ultima had an online version as well, with Diablo graphics. Good Diablo graphics. I mean, I still play Diablo 4, don't get me wrong. But Diablo 2, damn. And EverQuest from Sony. That was a huge game. EverQuest and EverQuest 2, still very popular. And of course, games continue to evolve. Got better and better graphics as the hardware also got better and more expensive. I don't want to know what an NVIDIA 4080 costs these days. But we got now games like The Witcher 3, which looks amazing still today. Game very old, still looks good. Horizon Zero Dawn, GTA 5. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. You can play this on your handheld device. A little bit contested, but Cyberpunk 2077. People didn't like this in the beginning because of the bugs. I loved it, and it looked amazing. Even without ray tracing, this game looks like the bomb. But I'm a big fan of Japan. Ghost of Tsushima, man. Those graphics are next level. It's not only the graphics that does it for me, but the atmosphere that game delivers, wow. And games are popular than ever. We have esports stuff. People come together in arenas and play games against each other for money and prizes and fame and glory. Again, not a world first. People were playing Nintendo Championships in 1989 already. People were coming together to play on a stage Tetris and other games against each other. And if they won, they got a golden cartridge. If you have one of those, you could probably auction it for $30,000. And I'm almost at my marker for the end here. I still have some anecdotes left. For example, on the left you see a normal Sega Genesis cartridge, and on the right you see one created by EA Sports. It's in the game. Now, the reason why they looked so different is very simple. EA didn't want to buy a license from Sega to release the games. So they locked a team up in a room, gave them a Mega Drive system, Genesis, And they reverse engineered the thing. They written down everything they knew on a book without anyone involved from the outside. Then they released that book to the lawyers and said, "Are we violating anything?" The lawyer said, "Looks good to me." And they managed to find a way to create games outside of Sega's licensing platform. And that's why the cartridges look different. Talking about Sonic 3, it was supposed to be larger than it was when released. But due to time constraints, they had to cut a lot of content. So they only released the top half of the console, of the game console. If you wanted the full Sonic 3 experience, you could later buy Sonic and Knuckles. You could play it standalone, but if you wanted a full game, you slot on your Sonic 3 cartridge on top of Sonic and Knuckles and had a full game, suddenly. And then they said, Sega was like, this game, this technology is brand new, we're going to do it more often, we're going to have more like these games. They only had this one. And also, Sega had this seal of quality. So if you delivered a game and you wanted that seal of quality on your game, that meant it was a good game, you had to send it to them, they have to check it, and then say, yes, this is good. But one of the things was, for it to be good, they did a rigorous set of play tests. And if it crashed, you did not get your seal of quality. And Sonic 3D Blast crashed a lot. Especially if you hit your console during gameplay, if you were very into the game, and then the console moved and then crash. And the lead developer said, I'm gonna build in a try-catch around the entire game and have it go to the level select screen. So whenever it crashes, congratulations, you found a secret. And you can choose any level you want. And they thought, the playtesters thought they found a feature, not a bug. So, bam, circumvented. And if you ever wondered why Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 was needing 45 gigabytes of memory, the reason is they wanted you to be able to swing through New York without suddenly midair loading and then continuing on. And how do they do this? In the PS5, it's easy. They have a very, very fast NVMe drive. This one had a 5,400 RPM hard disk. It wasn't capable of doing that fast loading. The solution was, we're going to repeat our textures over and over so that you can just load content from your game, and then, same mailbox graphic, same door, and then you didn't have to search around the disk for the content. That's why it's 45 gigs on your disk. That's a trick that they used. And that's all I have. So, thank you. And if you want to know more about games or want to see those videos, then you can find me just outside here. Thank you, and have a great day.